So Merfolk is becoming a larger part of the format, and whether you play the deck or not, understanding how it sideboards is important. So let's just dive straight into it. For Murktide, if you have dismembers in the sideboard, you should bring those in, since it's basically great versus all of their creatures. Their deck has a lot of 1-mana cards, and you can bring in chalices when you are on the play, yet I wouldn't recommend it, since even then it seems a little bit slow. You should bring in any bounce effects, mainly for Murktide and Ledger Shredder, but you can use them for any spot when necessary. Now you should also bring in some copies of Subtlety, since it is great for Murktide, and it can also trade with Darcy and has some other utility. Now for Graveyard Hate, Relic can be slow, and it isn't ideal, but I think you should still bring it in, and Unlicensed Hearse is great and should be brought in, but never bring in Grafdigger's Cage, since there's just no point. Now when it comes to cutting cards, completely cut out Force of Negation. It is only good versus EI, where it's just decent, and side out any Spreading Seas, but not Tideshaper, since you need that to block Ragavan. On the play, you should cut Tideshapers though, but always keep it for the draw, and the same applies for 1-drops like Curse Catcher and Dockhand. Now it is just hard to cut enough cards, so if you have to, I would trim on Lords in this order, and depending on your list, you need to prioritize which cards you bring in, so bring in the cards on the top first and the cards on the bottom last. Okay, so time to move on. For Hammer Time, bring in Hurtkul's Recall if you are still running the card that is. The same applies for Thieving Skydiver, but that card is basically long gone. Bring in Spreading Seas since you don't want Urza Saga to stay around, and for those who don't know the rules behind that, I am sorry, and something will be pinned in the comments for you. On the play, Chalice is justifiable, but I wouldn't do it. Dismember and Bounce effects are also great, so bring those in. Now for trimming cards, take out all Subtleties. They are only good versus Stoneforge, and even there, they are not good. You also don't want Curse Catcher. Now from here, it gets a little icky, since I think Force of Negation is just okay, so I wouldn't bring it in, but you don't have to take it out, yet if you don't like it, you could cut it. Glasspool is slow for the matchup, so it isn't that bad of a cut, and Swigoon is a little slow, so you could trim a copy since it isn't blocking Culture Complete anyway, and after that you might need to prioritize, so here's the same thing I did with Murktide but for Hammer Time. Okay, so time to move on to Rakdos Midrange. So bounce effects are decent, but they still have a lot of ETBs, so I wouldn't bring those in. Kira is great if you are running any copies of her, bring them all in. Spreading Seas is decent for Island Walk and card draw versus these midrange decks, so I would recommend bringing it in, but it isn't necessary. Now, Force of Negation has some good applications, but I don't like the idea of 2-for-1ing yourself versus a removal spell, and I wouldn't bring it in, but don't blame yourself if you bring it in, because some of the newer cards they are running are pretty good. Also, Dismember is great, bring in as many as you can, and Subtlety is pretty good, so cite that in as well. So you could cut Ether Vial because it is a bad draw late game, and it is weak to Kolgan's command, yet after that, cutting isn't too easy. You could trim on Lords, but that isn't ideal, so here are the cards to prioritize bringing in. So for Indomitable Creativity, you want all the counter magic, like Force of Negation, Spell Pierce, and Counterspell. Spreading Seas is great for cutting off red sources, and bounce effects are good to deal with an Archon or preventing an Archon. Dismember is good, but it can be a little too late, and I think having 2 Dismembers after sideboarding is reasonable. Now, I would cut Subtlety, and you could argue cutting Vial because of Prismari Command. After that, it isn't easy trimming on cards. You could cut Trickster because by the time it is relevant, it's basically GG, but it is still really good in other spots, so trimming on a Lord isn't a bad idea, but definitely not Vidalian Hexcatcher, and here are the cards to prioritize bringing in. Okay, so for 4-color money pile, if you have Kira, bring that in, bring in Dismember to deal with Omnath, and if you have Subtlety in the sideboard, bring that in as well. For cutting, I like to take out Force of Negation. You should also cut Spreading Seas, yet Tideshaper isn't bad, so I would keep it, but you could trim on some copies. I would also cut Curse Catcher. Now, if you need to prioritize what you're bringing in, here it is. For burn, you should also just bring in tons of counter magic, so bring in Force Negation, Spell Pierce, Flusterstorm, whatever you are running. Burn is also bad at using blue sources, so bring in Spreading Seas. Now, on the play, you could bring in Chalice of the Void. Now, I am not one to do this. I think it's too slow, but it could be really good, but never bring it in on the draw. Now, when it comes to cutting cards, cut out Dismember, since the 4 life just isn't worth it, and cut Subtlety, it just isn't good versus most of the targets, excluding Eidolon of the Great Revel, but Subtlety isn't worth it just for that one card. Now, if you are bringing in too many cards, here's what to prioritize. For Amulet Titan, you want to bring in Subtlety to deal with Primeval Titan and Dryad, and you should also bring in Dismember just so you can kill Dryad with it. Now, I find Spreading Seas too slow, so I would consider cutting it, but whatever you do, don't bring it in. Now, cutting other cards isn't easy, but I would say you could cut Hexcatcher because realistically speaking, the non-creature spell you want to counter costs 0 mana, and there is no way you will have enough fish to sack. You should also trim on Curse Catcher, and I don't think you will need to prioritize what you are bringing in here, but just in case, I think Subtlety is more important than Dismember. Now for Crashing Footfalls, it is rough since you want the full package to deal with the Footfalls, but you don't want to bring in so much. So I would recommend bringing in Chalice of the Void to put on 0. Force of Negation and other counter magic would be good, but there's one issue, being Teferi, so I would only bring in the best counter magic, and bounce effects are decent just for the tokens. Now Subtlety seems like an easy cut, but you cannot forget about Fury, yet I don't keep a card like that in my deck just for Fury, so this wasn't an easy choice, but I think you should cut Subtlety. Now, Curse Catcher and Dockhand are fine, so keep them in. Now, I would cut Spreading Seas and Tideshaper since your opponent is in blue, and they just don't provide too much value. Now, if you are bringing in too many cards, here's what to prioritize. So next we have one of the hardest decks to sideboard against. That would be Yawgmoth. Now, you want to bring in Subtlety and Spreading Seas. Subtlety because yeah, and Spreading Seas for Island Walk and Mana Screw. You want Graveyard Hate, especially Grafdigger's Cage, and Dismember if it is in your sideboard. Yet cutting cards versus this deck is really hard. I would probably trim on some Silvergills, not because it is bad, but because it is one of the weaker links versus that deck with only 1 toughness. You could get away with cutting Force Negation because it only counters Court of Calling and Eldritch Evolution, and after that you could maybe save Vodalian Hexcatcher because of the 1 toughness, yet I really don't like that idea. If you need to prioritize, here's how I would do it. Next is Living End. So you want Chalice of the Void and a general sense of counter magic. Remember to bring in Graveyard Hate, but not Grafdigger's Cage, because Grafdigger's Cage only counts cards coming from the graveyard, not exile. So first you should cut all copies of Subtlety and Spreading Seas, since they don't do much of anything. I would also cut Dismember because the only time you would use that card is when you're probably gonna lose anyway. Then you could cut Suilun because she's a little slow, yet I would not recommend it, and here is what to prioritize. Okay, so I went over the top 10 deck list, but why is this video not over? Well, we still didn't cover how to sideboard versus the best deck, being Merfolk. Okay, for the newer players, that was an unfortunate joke. Yet I want to cover the mirror match, and this is my video, so this is included. So I would bring in Dismember and whatever bounce effects you have. Subtlety will be decent, but your opponent has Aether Vial, and their threats are very 2-drop heavy, so it isn't the perfect card to bring in. We are also praying they don't get a God Hand with no islands, so don't bring in Spreading Seas. Now, Lore of Atlantis is now a bad magic card because it helps your opponent, and Master the Pearl Trident is amazing. So I would consider trimming on some Lords of Atlantis if you don't know what else to trim, since it's just a late game finisher. Now I would take out any Curse Catchers because what instance will your opponent have? I will also take out Force Negation for the same reason. And you could argue trimming islands, yet I would not recommend, and here's what to prioritize bringing in. I hope this helps, and I know I went through this fast, so if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I will try to get back to you, and I will see you next time.